Hi, and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes, an Old Testament scholar and professor at Biola University in Southern California. Today's video is going to be a little different for two reasons. First, it's going to introduce a section of the biblical text of Exodus and give some orienting teaching around the section we're about to enter. So we're not going to be looking at specific texts, but more big picture ideas. And also, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to share some new resources with you that I want you to be aware of. All right, so today we are talking about the covenant scroll of Exodus, which stretches from Exodus 20, verse 22 to 23:19 or 23:33, depending on who you ask. And today we're going to talk about how it works. Many people call this section of Exodus the covenant code, but code isn't quite the right word because this is not a comprehensive system of laws that can completely govern a people. Other people call it the book of the covenant. That doesn't quite work either because it's anachronistic. Books were not invented until long after the biblical period. So I think it's best to call this the covenant scroll. What we hear in these passages is Moses receiving verbally God's teaching up on the mountain, which he later writes down and relays to the people when he rejoins them. So last week we looked at the people's request for a mediator. They asked God not to speak to them directly because they had this sense of their inadequacy, their vulnerability to the divine presence. They asked for a mediator, and God allowed that and said Moses could be their mediator. So what we have in the covenant scroll is the mediated instruction of Yahweh that was given at Mount Sinai. It's a combination of at least two different kinds of laws or instructions. One set is called apodictic or absolute prohibitions. You must not, kind of like the Ten Commandments. There are a few of these in these chapters. Most of them are what's called casuistic law or case law that address particular situations, non-ideal situations, and say how to handle them or what the parameters are. In Hebrew, the word for these laws, these casuistic laws, are the mishpatim, or the judgments of God regarding particular cases. The section begins and ends with a promise of God's presence, and we'll find out next week the specifics of this of the laws regarding worship, or the instructions regarding worship. There's a grammatical pattern that we'll see picking up in chapter 21, verse 2 and following in the Mishpatim. There's a grammatical pattern of ki-im. Ki is the particle that kicks off a primary ruling. It's like a paragraph marker or signals a new topic. And then im is a particle that tells us like bullet points under that main primary ruling, or we could refer to them as secondary rulings, special cases within that category. So we'll be paying attention to those and dealing with them in their paragraphs. It's good for us to stop and remember before we read these laws that the laws in the Old Testament were not Israel's means of salvation. Yahweh had already rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He had already adopted them as his people at Mount Sinai before he gave them the laws. The laws are rather a means of fulfilling their mission as his people to demonstrate his character and his goodness among the nations. Now, a few things that we should notice about the laws. They're embedded in this story of deliverance from slavery. This is not God dishing out random instructions to strangers on the street. These are the people he saved. They regulate communal life under God's rule. The overarching premise of the covenant scroll is that Yahweh is king of Israel as a nation, and that he wants to train them to reflect his character to a watching world. If they live faithfully to these instructions, that helps them fulfill their mission as God's representatives. They are the people who bear God's name, as we talked about with chapter 20, verse 7. they should be marked by loyal and exclusive love for Yahweh and for their neighbor. And so that's kind of the overarching picture of what we're looking at here. Now, you might be aware that there were other law collections in the ancient Near East. The biblical law collection is not entirely unique. There are 7 such collections, and they're all included in Martha Roth's book, Law Collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. This is the 2nd edition. All 7 of these are included here in full. The laws of Ur-Nammu or Ur-Namma, Lipit Ishtar, Eshnunna, Hammurabi, the Hittite laws, the Middle Assyrian laws, and the Neo-Babylonian laws. These span a time period from 2100 BC all the way to 700 BC. And so you can imagine the appearance of the covenant scroll is partway through this series of law collections that arose in various cultures around the ancient Near East. These collections, if you read them, which you can easily do in an afternoon, they're not that long, and most of these in here will give you like the Akkadian and its translation. So it does not take long to read through these laws. You'll find that they deal with similar concerns. There's a lot of topical overlap with the Bible's laws, and they have similar penalties. For example, 25% of the laws of Hammurabi overlap in content. They cover the same topics as the covenant scroll in the Bible. Some people have said, oh, this means that the Bible's borrowing directly or depending on these other law traditions. And I would say a better way of looking at it, most scholars today, instead of pointing to direct dependence, would say there's a shared legal tradition and all of them are drawing on it. So the Bible's not coming out of nothing. It's participating in wider conversations about what a just and ordered society looks like. Now, there are differences between the biblical laws and the laws in these collections. Let me give you a list of 9 differences between biblical law and the law of these collections. First of all, the biblical law, the covenant scroll, is embedded in a covenant with a deity. This is unheard of in the ancient world. The laws are given in the voice of Yahweh. Yahweh is the one speaking these laws rather than the king. The collection includes statutes about worship and religious rituals. This is unique. Other law collections don't have anything to do with worship in the temple. The king of Israel, eventually, is subject to the laws rather than the source of the laws. So instead of this being the declaration of the king about how he wants the society to be, we have a divine king, and any human king has to rule under the divine king's authority. Some of the laws are focused on reducing economic disparity between various members of Israelite society. This is unique. Also, they have a more protective impulse towards women and children than we see in other laws. There is no death penalty for property crimes in the biblical law. No one is put to death for stealing something or for losing something. Property crimes are fined. They might have to make restitution for what was lost or stolen, but it never is an occasion to put someone to death. There's no reduced penalty if you injure a servant rather than a free person. The life of a servant and the health of a servant is just as valuable as the health of a free person in ancient Israel. And finally, there are no third-party punishments in the biblical text. Some of these ancient law codes mandate that the son or daughter or wife of the offender is put to death or taken in as a consequence to what they did. And the biblical law never does that. The one who did the crime is the one who pays for the crime. So those are some differences. This is just, again, kind of globally setting us up for what we're about to see. We'll work our way little by little, as we have been through the rest of the book of Exodus. We'll work our way through the covenant scroll. This, I think, is such a rich part of the Old Testament. We don't normally think of biblical law as being inspiring, but I've been inspired over and over by these laws and thinking about how thoughtful God was as he set up the Israelite society. Now, before you go, I want to tell you about 2 resources. Last week, I shared with you about Gary Schnittjer's and Matthew Harmon's book, How to Study the Bible's Use of the Bible. So I'm putting that back on your radar again. Also wanting to introduce a massive book that Gary Schnittjer released a couple of years ago now, and it's a book-by-book guide to the Old Testament use of the Old Testament. So this is dealing with places in the Old Testament that quote or allude to or echo other Old Testament passages. This is an underappreciated aspect of studying the Bible's use of the Bible. And Gary's given us an amazing resource that catalogs every time there's an exegetical reuse of the Old Testament in another passage. And he has like commentary discussion on those passages with his take on what's going on as the later biblical author is reusing that passage. What are they doing with it? So you'll find that at the beginning of every book, there is a chart showing the use of Scripture in that book and other Old Testament books' use of that passage. So it's an invaluable resource. I'm so glad to have it on my shelf for when I'm working on projects related to the Old Testament, use of the Old Testament. It's a great resource. I hope you check it out and have a great week.